Evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Sydney and the United States Studies Centre events. I'm Hayley Channer. I'm the Director of the Economic Security Program at the US Studies Centre. And here our motto is that we do analysis of America, insights for Australia, and solutions for the Alliance. And as part of that, we're bringing this event to you tonight about Trump's tariffs and the future of the global order. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we meet tonight. Indigenous Australians were this country's first traders and its first diplomats, and we are delighted to host another very distinguished diplomat here, Ambassador Kurt Tong, all the way from Washington, DC. Ambassador Tong's visit comes at a period of significant turbulence and change in the United States and the Indo-Pacific region. The US trajectory on trade and diplomacy for the next 3.5 years seems quite uncertain, and the global economic order is undergoing a rapid transformation away from free trade, but towards what we're really not sure. Around the world, nations are grappling with a more fragmented and unpredictable economic landscape where trade, technology, supply chains, and multilateral institutions are increasingly shaped not by cooperation with one another, but actually by geopolitical competition. To help us make sense of this new dynamic, we are really lucky to be joined by two people who understand these changing dynamics from having worked inside the US government at the most senior levels and have been deeply integrated within the Indo-Pacific region through working there for many years. First, we have Ambassador Kurt Tong. Ambassador Tong served for 3 decades with the US Department of State and as a career Foreign Service officer. This includes postings such as Consul General and Chief of Mission in Hong Kong and Macau, Deputy Chief of Mission to Tokyo, and other postings to Seoul and Manila. He also served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs. And relevant to this discussion today, Ambassador Tong was also one of the architects of a major trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we now know as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US is actually not a member of. And he also was one of the architects of the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement. So he deeply understands the value of trade and its role in the Indo-Pacific region, and his views on the US administration will be very insightful and informative for us. And alongside Ambassador Tong, we have Dr. Michael J. Green. Dr. Green is a professor and the Chief Executive Officer at the United States Studies Centre. Previously, he was the Senior Vice President for Asia at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, which is a think tank in Washington, DC. He's on leave from Georgetown University, where he was the Director of Asian Studies. And actually, like Ambassador Tong, Dr. Green also served on the National Security Council at the White House. So both gentlemen bring extreme expertise to this discussion, and I'm really looking forward to that tonight. So what I'm going to start off with is I'm going to start by giving the audience what it came here for, and that is all about Trump's tariffs. Tariffs are a tax on imported goods imposed when goods come across the border, and they're paid by the importing company. To us in Australia, the US tariff policy looks chaotic. President Trump will announce tariffs, he'll impose tariffs, but then he'll put a pause on tariffs. He'll also increase the amount of tariff, and you just don't know where the policy is going to go. And that really creates a lot of uncertainty for Australian businesses, also uncertainty for American businesses who are paying those taxes on their import goods. I think one of the recent examples we saw was toy company Mattel saying that it would need to raise its prices on US toys. And in response, President Trump said he would raise the tariffs even higher if they didn't like it. So it really creates big challenges for business. So my first question, first to Ambassador Tong, and then Mike, I'll get you to jump in, is what do you think President Trump is seeking to achieve through these tariffs? Will there actually be a landing point of US policy on tariffs, do you think, in his administration? And is there going to be a longer term impact of these tariffs and the tariff uncertainty?
Well, thank you, Hayley, and really a great pleasure to be here. It's a beautiful campus. I've never haven't been on the University of Sydney campus before, so I'm really excited to be here and have a chance to share some time with you all. So President Trump, whom I've never met, but I've heard of him. I imagine most of you all have as well. Appears in my sense to have come to the office in second time with an economic policy that built around tax reduction domestically, deregulation, intending to spur the revitalization of investment in the United States, and then a very aggressive approach towards reindustrialization using external facing policy, mainly tariffs. And so from his perspective, the tariffs this is going to sound a little bit facetious, but are an almost magical tool whereby one can accomplish several missions simultaneously. Onshoring manufacturing capacity to help the reindustrialization of the United States being the most important among those, but also balancing the U.S. external trade deficit, raising revenue in order to allow for tax cuts in alternative tax categories, like income tax cuts or corporate tax cuts. And we're seeing a lot of that now in the major economic bill that's pending, finding its way through Congress. But also the president's attracted to it because his approach to international affairs generally is a highly transactional one. And transactional means you need leverage, and tariffs are his favorite form of leverage. And so you've seen him using tariffs as a stick, not a carrot, to hit or punish other countries that don't do what he wants on a variety of topics that are not directly related to trade. So that's the background story behind why he's done this. And he's basically, he did a lot of tariffs in his first time around, mainly focused on China, mainly focused on trying to rectify that economic relationship from his perspective. Now it's the entire world trying to do too much too fast. And so the big mistake that the president made was overconfidence in this tool, and then also not understanding the downsides of it and how it actually works. As you pointed out, expensive toys, disrupted supply chains, financial markets going sideways. And so he's had to pull back significantly from a very much too overextended use of tariffs as a policy tool to now just much too overextended use of them, and some moderation of the approach. And that's kind of in a nutshell where we are now, I think.
Kurt, before I go to Mike, do you think that the administration will continue to change its tariff policy for the next 3.5 years until the end of Donald Trump's term? Or do you think that there'll be a settling point sort of in the next 6 months and we'll get more of a sense of what the next couple of years will look like?
I think 6 months might be too short, but by the end of the year, I would expect us to be settled into a pattern that has roughly this 10% targeted tariff level applied to most countries. So essentially a blanket import tax applied on imports from around the world. And then a higher tariff on China, maybe somewhere between 25 and 40% range, depending on the negotiations that take place between now and the end of the year. And then maybe a few other peaks by country, but then also, and most distressingly for some exporting economies, some sectoral tariffs that the president seems very committed to on automobiles, steel, and then perhaps also pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. Again, with the objective of pushing those manufacturing of those items into the United States. Problem again is it's an unrealistic time frame, and you end up damaging the very companies that you want to have invest in the United States. How that plays out will be the central piece of a lot of the negotiations for, say, Japan and Korea, Taiwan, Europe, over the next few months. But anyways, to your question, I think things will settle down to roughly that level by the end of the year. And then the next big milestone will be the US midterm election in late 26. And at that point, we'll find out how much inflation and dissatisfaction with economic circumstances gets blamed on the Trump tariffs. And that will shape the second half of his administration, I think, and whether there's any further tariff reduction. But right now, I'm not counting on that taking place.
Yeah, to your point, I have heard that Australian company BlueScope Steel, which faces 25% tariffs, is looking to move its operations to the United States. So in one sense, that could be President Trump's tariffs working in that he is bringing more industry to the United States. But of course, that means that Australia loses out. Mike, you have been observing the tariff developments over the last couple of months. From your perspective, what do you think the administration is trying to achieve through tariffs? And what kind of impact do you think it's going to have on US alliances with Australia and also with Japan?
As Kurt was talking, I was having a flashback to the 1990s. I think it must have been around 1992 or 3 when we first met. We were 6 years old. Kurt was actually a junior officer on the Japan desk of the State Department working on economics. And I was doing my PhD at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and we had a Benkyokai. We're both Japan experts. So we had a Benkyokai, the Japanese call it, which is a study group where you drink. So we would meet at a restaurant that anyone who served in Washington, like Jane, will remember, called Sushi Taro, a Japanese restaurant right around the corner from the Australian embassy. And we would meet, I think, once a month or so and have our Benkyokai, and we drink sake and beer. We had people from the Japanese embassy, from Congress, industry associations, all in their sort of 20s. I mean, everyone was 6 years old. And we were meeting because the Clinton administration came into office, as you'll recall, with a certain assumption about international trade, and especially Japan. And that was that Japan had figured out this masterful model of import substitution, high non-tariff barriers to beat America's auto industry, to beat America's steel industry. And Bill Clinton ran on a promise to create a Ministry of International Trade and Industry, a National Economic Council, all these things that the Japanese had used. And the whole argument was we're going to essentially have managed trade with Japan. And the entire premise of trade strategy towards Asia and Japan, we knew as Japan scholars, was completely wrong. That's not how Japan worked, and it wasn't how Japan worked anymore. The Japanese model was falling apart in the early 90s. And so we were meeting partly to lament this very poor analytical premise for a much more protectionist approach to Asia and Japan. People forget this. This is a little bit cyclical. But we also were meaning to say, okay, they're wrong. They're going to be proven wrong. So what do we do with Japan? What do we do in Asia? And we were bouncing around ideas like bilateral free trade agreements, ideas like what became TPP. I forget where you went after that, to the embassy in Tokyo, maybe?
Did.
And I went finished my PhD, went into the Pentagon. And, you know, we built a completely, not we, but the United States built a completely different relationship with Japan. When we were essentially on the same side on trade. So I just mentioned that because this is a little bit like that, with the important exception that the analytical predicate or analytical assumptions behind the Trump approach to tariffs are, like Clinton was a little bit wrong. This is really wrong. But it's worth remembering because we're going to have to rebuild. There's going to be an effort to rebuild trade strategy in the US, economic statecraft, what the global order looks like, because the premise behind all this is just wrong. It's flawed. Tariffs are not going to raise revenue. Trump got elected. All the analysis shows clearly primarily because of inflation, and of course tariffs cause inflation. And in all the surveys in the U.S. right now, all of them, his tariff policy is unpopular. In some border states, New York, Massachusetts, it has 15% support in some polling that I've seen. That's not public. So it's deeply, deeply unpopular. It's not why he got elected. I'm actually maybe even a little more skeptical than Kurt about how sustainable this is politically. The US had the lowest average tariff rate in the G7 last year, below 3%. Japan was lower, amazingly. But the US had a lower average tariff rate than Germany, Canada, and most of the G7. So in a way, there is room to adjust. But what did you call it? This might go from very, very extreme to just very extreme.
I said, like 3 varies.
Yeah.
Down to
Yeah,
just
very, very,
one and
very
a-
bad.
one-
Very
one-
bad.
1.5 varies, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's not just inflation, it's gonna have a recession effect if Trump keeps doing this, because businesses can't plan, especially US, Canada, but also US, Japan. Yes, you might get some factories or investment to move to the US, but companies can't plan investment. They can't do greenfield investment. They can't build new plants. They can't hire people with this much uncertainty. Everybody from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Post is screaming this to Trump, and I'm sure Treasury Secretary Bessent and others are. So, the President Trump does have some sense of self-preservation. So we'll see how sustainable this is. He loves tariffs. It's one of his oldest themes. And he loves, as Kurt said, the leverage and the unpredictability he gets. Some of you have heard me say Donald Trump has been in more than 4,000 lawsuits. He's lost most of them. You don't do that unless you're, prepared to settle and say you won. So in a lot of these trade negotiations, as long as Donald Trump can declare victory, there's a way out of this. There will be a certain level of tariffs that were not there before, that's for sure. Maybe it's 10% average tariff rate, maybe it's 15 or 20. That even is politically hard to sustain. But people need to sort of understand this pattern. The other thing, by the way, real quickly is, my first job in government was in USTR, the US Trade Representative's Office, and it was understaffed in the best of times. They are now picking trade wars with everyone. There is no way that the US government or the USTR can monitor all these agreements. So yeah, Blue Scope may say we're planning investment in the US, and then probably shouldn't say this too loudly. And everyone applauds, and there's going to be no monitoring of that. There's going to be no enforcement of that. So a lot of this is going to be theater, frankly.
For Australia, tariffs aren't as big of an issue as they are for countries like Japan, China, Vietnam. So for Australia, for instance, we have the baseline tariff, the 10%, plus in different sectors like steel and aluminium, we have that 25%. But it's basically the best deal that any country is getting. The problem is that close US allies like Japan, and Japan is also a partner of Australia, are facing much higher tariffs because they have a much greater trade surplus with the United States in terms of they are selling a lot more to the US than they are buying from the US, and that's what President Trump is trying to address. Kurt, you look at Japan a lot. How are Trump's tariffs being perceived in Japan, and what's the Japanese government trying to do in terms of addressing this issue? And are there any learnings that a country like Australia can take?
So Australia is doing the perfectly logical thing of not jumping in too quickly to negotiate against themselves, which is the format that countries are being asked to do. Countries are being asked to fill out a form of all the concessions that they're going to make, submit it, and get comments on it, like they're grad student, right? And then be told to try again until the deadline runs out. And then, as Mike said, for relatively low stakes negotiations like the US-Australia one, victory will be declared. I really like your lawsuit settlement analogy. And then things will move on. And I think Australia is doing the right thing. I guess Prime Minister, it's been explained to me, set out some red lines. These are things we're not going to do. Other things we might consider. So not too confrontational, but clear. It's pretty much the right approach. Japan has so I'm not sure that Australia should learn from Japan as much as Japan should learn from Australia in terms of negotiating strategy. The Japanese government has tried to maintain dignity, leverage, and use the clock to its advantage. Again, President Trump would like to get a deal with Japan. He doesn't want to not get a deal, because if he doesn't get a deal, then financial markets are unhappy. Everyone criticizes him for damaging the US-Japan relationship, and the taxes go up, and he doesn't get anything because there's no deal. So he wants a deal where he gets something that he can announce as the benefits for it. So Japan is constructing a few tariff concessions, a few non-tariff concessions. Recently, they proposed publicly mutual recognition of automobile standards, which is a pretty smart judo move, right? Because the US has been complaining about automobile standards in Japan for a long time. The Japanese public doesn't want to have US cars imported according to some foreign standard. But if it's mutual recognition, it's great. Now, Japanese cars exported to the United States already meet US standards, right? So it's a nice, you know, these guys are good. The other thing that they're doing is probably preparing to make soft promises. I don't want to call them false promises, like soft promises, to do things like maybe explore shipbuilding in the United States, or investment in that, or maybe invest in the pipeline across Alaska for natural gas, and which the US has been pushing for. They're very risky projects. Japanese would prefer not to be involved in them, but they might say, you know, we're going to think about it, and with attitude, and
Feeling.
that combined with a few statements about working together to contain China probably gets them the basic package, and then to the 10% package, and then they really need to get the 25% autos tariff off. The Prime Minister of Japan recently said that he's targeting the G7 meeting. Sorry, long answer, but for anyone who's interested in this, he's targeting the G7 meeting for conclusion. That to me says that he's maybe getting some traction on that issue. That is the issue that Japan needs the US to concede on, because it'd be extraordinarily damaging for Japanese industry if their cars get taxed at 25%. That's 1/3 of their exports to the United States. They're much more dependent on the US market than Australia is. So we'll see how that goes.
I want to shift more regionally and look at some other countries as well, because tariffs were one way that President Trump wanted to address trade deficits between the US and other countries, where he was frustrated that the US wasn't manufacturing and exporting as much as it was buying from other countries. However, one of the other US government priorities is actually to build new supply chains that don't always go through China, because they're worried about the strategic vulnerability of China cutting off supply chains. So my question for you, so when tariffs, for instance, were imposed on countries like Vietnam, they faced a higher tariff than China in some circumstances because of how much they sell to the US versus how much they buy. But Vietnam was one of the primary countries in Southeast Asia where new supply chains were being stood up that could help diversify that risk away from China. Do you think that the United States has been undercutting some of its other foreign and defense policy goals through the tariff policy?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, of course. And the Republicans in Congress people are waiting for the Republicans in Congress to rise up and stop Trump. That's not how politics works. You don't win the House, the Senate, the popular vote, and the Electoral College as president and have your own party didn't turn on you. It was a narrow victory, by the way. It's questionable whether it's a mandate, but there's no precedent. People are waiting for the wrong thing if they expect the Republicans to sort of rise up and start attacking Trump. It will be more subtle, and you're seeing it in Ukraine already, and it will be in trade as well, but it will be in ways where members are in closed conference rooms where nobody understands what's happening. For example, right now is the big beautiful
Bill.
Act is being negotiated between Senate and House. But the default position, the majority position in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, and in public opinion is, yeah, China has been cheating. China is the pacing challenge. There's a long list of things that Americans, Japanese, Europeans can point to about Chinese economic policy. To deal with that, we need our allies. So calling like an old Western movie, the sheriff calling together the posse to deal with the bad guy up in the mountains, and then pulling the pistol out and starting to shoot at the posse is not good. Doesn't make for a good Western. And it maybe a comedy, and it doesn't make for good strategy. And most the public opinion polls show that the public knows that. The American public supports allies. The Congress is worried about it. Now, in the current environment, it's interesting, the Lowy poll in March showed that 36% of Australians trust the US right now. Sounds about right. But 80% support the alliance. In Japan, the number is about 30-some% trust the US right now, and 90% support the alliance. Similar numbers in Korea, and the Philippines are similar. Joe Biden, when he was running for president, said, "Don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the other guy." And compared to the other guy, even this trade policy and inconsistency, it's the only Americans you got, and you've got to work with them because the security threats from China, the economic challenges, and the economic advantage of the US, foreign direct investment. People always talk about trade with China. Yes, China is Australia's largest trading partner, but if you look at foreign direct investment, it's overwhelmingly the US, Japan, Europe. And I think, frankly, Canberra, Tokyo have figured out some of what we're talking about and how you maneuver this. It's a little terrifying and frightening, but there's a bit of a pattern. So I think the alliances, you asked earlier about the alliances, I think the alliances, the public opinion polling about the US is going to take a hit, but the alliances are not, because there's a logic to it. And within the Trump administration, Marco Rubio, Hegseth in the Pentagon, the intelligence community, the Congress, it is a lot of deep support for US alliances to try to get through this. Doesn't mean it would be fun, but there's something there.
I want to pivot to talking about the second half of the event tonight, which is the global order part. And if we look at the global trading order and the architecture whereby states are working together, one of those groups is the World Trade Organization, but then you also have lots of other economic groupings. We mentioned the CPTPP before. There's other regional trade groupings. However, the US is not a member of any regional free trade grouping since it withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Under President Biden, he did try and launch this new initiative, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, which was not free trade, but at least it was about standardizing things, digital trade. It was also about environmental standards and work standards. I wanted to ask you both, I'll start with Kurt. What does this new future look like where countries are walking away from free trade and they're making more managed trade, and also they are de-risking or decoupling in technology? What does the new order that we are transitioning to look like for countries like Australia, which rely on free trade? When we were faced economic coercion by China, when China stopped buying a lot of our goods, the global marketplace allowed us to sell those goods elsewhere, but that's only because it was a rules-based order. So Kurt, from your perspective, what replaces this free trade order?
Well, I think, one point to emphasize based on the early discussion, then transition to that, is the question about, and just introducing vocabulary for, I think everyone has it already, but the difference between onshoring and friendshoring. And President Trump is an onshorer. He wants everything made in the United States. Biden was more of a friendshorer. As long as it's not made in China, it's reliable, or Russia or Iran or other problematic actors. That if onshoring continues as a philosophy, which it will for the remaining 3 years and 8 months of
Not that you're counting on
of the Trump presidency,
Yeah.
there's somewhere there's a a day calendar that clicks or minutes. The, in that context, what I expect to happen in the near term is trade. I want to distinguish between trade policy and technology policy. Sorry, it's getting a little wonky on y'all here, but
That's what they're here for. I'm pretty
okay,
sure.
okay. So on trade policy, the U.S. is out of the picture, and China is out of the picture by default because it's not a market economy as externally facing. It's a complicated picture. It's half market, half state run, but it doesn't. It's not willing to open itself up, its capital account. It's not willing to open up its markets in a thoroughgoing fashion, or play by rules sets like those set in the CPTPP. Therefore, it's out. The WTO is non-functional. I think that on trade policy, the organizations that do not have either the US or China as members, which means TPP, the European Union-based organizations, will be the central playing field for trade policy over the next 4, 5, 6 years. Depends on if the US gets its act together or not, which I'm not all that optimistic about, unfortunately, because the Dems don't have their heads in the right place either. And that's exciting for Australia as a leader in that context. So everyone wants to join TPP, except the United States. Even China wants to join, but they're not qualified. So what does that do? That means that Japan, Australia, Singapore have great leverage to liberalize the economies of Southeast Asia, bring in European economies, bring in some other regional economies, maybe put some leverage, some pressure on India to be more open to trade and investment, and keep pushing forward on the global economic integration project that has entered a period of interruption because of the same socio-economic forces that led to Brexit in the UK, or to the MAGA populism in the United States. That is my hopeful side, is that pushes forward. On digital, I wouldn't rule the United States out, because I think in digital policy and how online digital services activity and regulatory structures evolve, the US is not pulling back. And I think that the United States will be part of this bifurcation of global digital activity into China and non-China. And that's proceeding. It's an intentional part of US policy. You see it through the technology denial policy, which will come back to the fore in the US. It's on pause right now as everyone chases tariffs, but it'll come back. And China is intentionally excluding all digital actors from its economy. And there's going to be this bifurcation in that space where I think the US may stay on side with its friends and allies. So kind of a complicated picture. WTO, I don't even know, whatever. Sadly for me, I spent like how many years of my life working on APEC? I had like the expectations for APEC because the US is in it. And I can't decide whether the US, Russia, or China are the biggest problem members of APEC. If APEC could get rid of the three of us, it would be a great organization.
Just for people who aren't familiar with that acronym APEC, it's the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, and I appreciate they're all adjectives in search of a noun, as Australia's previous Foreign Minister Gareth Evans famously said. But APEC was established back in the late 1980s by Australia to create less friction for trade, more cross-border trade, and generally create a more integrated Indo-Pacific region where countries could focus on what their comparative advantages were and efficiently trade things at the cheapest prices. I'll ask Mike you the same question, and then I'll actually go to audience questions. So please think of what you would like to ask either Kurt, Mike, or both of them. But Mike, to you, what do you think is going to replace the order that we've had for so many decades that many countries, including the United States, have benefited from, which is why they established that free trading order in the first place. What replaces that order, and is it small groupings like the G7 plus or some grouping of the OECD or something? Is it the case we need to move to smaller groups, or that's not going to help either?
I'm smiling because if we were at the University of Tokyo instead of the University of Sydney, the moderator would say APEC, which was started by Japan with Australia's help. But all great things have multiple parentage.
Yeah.
So I think Kurt's point about onshoring versus friendshoring is reshoring versus friendshoring is a really important one. I think the American public would support a policy that actually increased investment in manufacturing in the US. The US economy as a destination for foreign direct investment in normal times is extremely attractive. Low energy prices, incredible research and development ecosystems around Harvard and MIT, Caltech, Berkeley, states competing with each other to provide incentives, lots of variety in terms of water topography. And so it should be a very attractive place, and manufacturing investment was increasing in the US. What President Trump is doing is the exact opposite of what you do. If you want foreign direct investment, you want predictable tariff and tax policy. You don't attack Harvard and your major research institutions. You don't attack law firms because rule of law is one of the attractive things. So Winston Churchill reportedly said, it probably wasn't him, you can count on the Americans to do all the wrong thing before they eventually get to the right thing. And this is really the wrong thing. And I think that's important to remember, because if you look at the longer sweep of American history, there's a proud tradition of messing things up and then realizing it and quickly recovering. So I do think there's going to be that's why I mentioned Kurt and I meeting in the 90s. I do think there's going to be, out of this Schumpeterian destruction, a moment of real creativity of a new set of rules. It may not happen under President Trump. It won't happen under the current Trump administration, because that would require strategy. And I don't think the administration has strategy. The president is dismantling the National Security Council staff, where Kurt and I work. The whole point of that staff is to integrate trade, security, technology to have a national strategy. And it's pretty clear the president doesn't want to be constrained by, coordination of interests. He really prefers to go out each day and swing a different, tool. So it may not happen right now, but I do think it's going to happen. And I agree with Kurt. The U.S. is in a position to really, in fact, it's really the only economy in a position to define digital AI and information rules for a variety of regions, size of the economy, Silicon Valley, the closeness to Japan, Korea, Taiwan. So and frankly, as a guy who also, not as much as Kurt, also worked on US-Australia FTA, Korea FTA. I remember I was in the White House. We got a cable from Kurt Tong, the Economic Council in Seoul, proposing a US-Korea free trade agreement. And I thought, nice try, Kurt. And a year later, there we were. Well done. And the US-Korea free trade agreement is a pretty significant piece of liberalization and harmonization. So I don't think it's going to be around trade liberalization, frankly. I think a lot of people in DFAT are all about trade liberalization, which makes sense if you're the Australian economy. I don't think the action in Washington or Europe, frankly, and Japan's reaching diminishing returns. It's not around trade liberalization, it's around rulemaking. So I agree with Kurt, digital especially, product placement. Next week, we're announcing a new program and a new senior scholar at our center who will focus on digital policy and AI. And we're making that investment. We've got somebody really good who knows the US and Australia well, because as Kurt said, Australia is positioned to start shaping these rules. The debate here on AI and digital is a bit behind where the US, UK are in some ways, but Australia moves quickly. And so I think that's definitely an area where the rules will move, and they'll change. I think digital rules in Australia will definitely be different in a few years. Very different. We can talk about how, but yeah, worth watching.
All right, well, let's open it up to the audience now to keep talking. When I invite people to ask a question, can you please say your name and affiliation, and keep your questions short so that we can get to as many questions as possible. So the gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name's Peter Trusham, and I'm actually not affiliated with anybody. I'm just interested. I'd like to present a little bit of a critical criticism of what you said. I'm just wondering if you've left the elephant out of the room, which is Xi Jinping's China and his plans to create a new world order based on authoritarianism. I don't know if you've read Kevin Rudd's book recently on Xi Jinping's China, but it's a little bit scary if you read it to see the expanse of their plan. And a part of that would be trade. And I think you said that China has been cheating. And in a way, what you've been presenting seems to be the status quo of what's been happening for a long time. And to me, it seems like it's failing. It has failed, and it's given rise to this great threat that threatens our world order with an authoritarian world order. So I'm just wondering if what's happened in America is a reaction to some of this, because we have to be realistic. China is dumping. It's using trade to try to destroy our world order, which was based on rules. But if you take those rules away, which they're trying to do, and create new rules, your world order you're talking about, the rules, is not relevant anymore. And so for me, I see that we're on the crux of a new world order, but what's it going to be? And maybe the reaction of the American people, is it a good reaction against the status quo in America to bring in a reaction against what's happening that could threaten our whole global order? That's my question. Well, it's not a question.
Would you like
Well,
to?
I would just say that's not a criticism at all. In fact, I'd say that's the backdrop for everything we're saying. There's a reason 90% of Japanese support the alliance, 80% of Australians support the alliance in spite of all this. And I think the default position, we do polling at the center, and the American and Australian and Japanese public's view of China is pretty much the same. And they basically agree with you for the most part. 55, 60% actually in our polls say something similar. And so, you know, this is not the policy you would create if you were trying to do something about China, but it has all the pieces. So the Trump administration is heavily pivoting to Asia in a way that, you know, Obama and Trump 1 and Biden just talked about. Europeans would say too much. There is a continuity on technology competition. You know, Biden, well, if Harris had won, her trade policy on China would have been very tough. The difference is that the Trump dimension brings more disruption, more change, but also a lot of chaos. But I think the default position for the American political system, and frankly for the alliance, is not too far off from what you're saying, notwithstanding the fact that Australia has far greater trade dependence on China and things like that. So,
Kurt, what do you think?
Yeah, I would add to that and say that in the military realm, US and Australia, I believe, approaches are fairly clear that the goal is containing China's ability to be aggressive in the region. That's, you know, difficult but achievable objective, I believe. In the economic realm, the goal has been to simultaneously contain and entangle the Chinese economy, and that has gotten lost in the current U.S. approach because it's not China focused. I mean, in the first Trump administration, the trade policy was aggressive and China focused. In this administration, it's focused on everybody. It's like equal opportunity, bad policy directed at the entire planet. So although some of it, the rhetoric around it gets dressed up in the United States in a China-focused way, it's actually not a China-focused policy. Mr. Besant has tried to make it that by getting all the tariffs down as far as he can and keeping some on China in the trade area. And tariffs actually don't hurt China that much, and it's not that big a deal for them. But if you're going to do it, you should at least do it in a rational fashion, and that's not what the United States has been doing. And then in the values battle, the United States has also made backward progress in that area and this is where I'm going to be a little bit more critical of President Trump, is by undermining democratic values and norms inside the United States. He's actually weakened the position of the U.S. in bolstering such values in other countries to resist China's desire, which I think it can only be categorized as a desire, not a plan, and certainly not a successful plan to change how other countries govern themselves. China would love to have everyone around the world become an authoritarian transactional regime. They have almost no ability to make that happen. And when people write about that as like a plan that's achievable, it's an exaggeration. But the countries can screw up themselves in that regard. And we're seeing a bit of that in the United States. And that's my deepest worry, frankly, about what's been transpiring in this area.
The gentleman at the back.
Hello, I'm Hercules Chu, and I'm a PhD candidate here at the Sydney School of Education and Social Work. I have a question for Ambassador Tong. So it's about what do you think about the future economic situation of Hong Kong, given your career experience, and how will you analyze how the Trump's tariff and the Sino-US conflict impact on that? And as you mentioned, there may be some differences between the Trump's first administration and the second one. So how will you analyze about it? Thank you.
Yeah. Are you from Hong Kong?
Yes, I'm from Hong Kong.
And you're a PhD candidate, so you probably know what Schumpeterian means. I lost that one.
That's an economics.
Is it? Sorry, I haven't been to grad school yet. So Hong Kong, I think, has very resilient people, very smart, lots of human resources, good infrastructure, basically a sound regulatory system to adapt to international trade and investment trends, and what has shown great resilience over the years. The difficulties that Hong Kong faces are self-generated political problems, and based upon how Hong Kong adapts to being part of an authoritarian regime, and then being caught in international efforts to isolate China. On both those scores, I think there's a path forward. If Hong Kong politics stabilize in a way that while many democratic rights have been taken away, there's still basic freedom of information, especially as faces the business community, still basic rule of law as faces the sanctity of contracts and the like. And interoperability with the global economic system is maintained, and the regulatory system remains transparent on things that matter to Hong Kong and international business. In a business sense, in an economic sense, Hong Kong will be okay. The other risk area is slowing of the Chinese economy. The parts of the Hong Kong economy that depend upon fast economic growth in China are going to have harder times ahead. And then the disruption between the US and China economic connectivity eventually will be a drag on Hong Kong. If trade volumes drop, that could be a problem for the port and the airport. If investment volumes, cross-border investment volumes stay down the way that they have, there will be fewer deals done. Hong Kong's showing resilience by becoming the international financial center for China rather than a global financial center. And IPOs, for example, are up, and the stock market is resilient and strong. But it's a much more challenging environment than it was a decade ago, for sure. And if the troubles, the political troubles in Hong Kong had not happened, and the U.S. and China were getting along, and China was still headed towards more reform and opening, Hong Kong would be like, you know, kicking butt in the region, like really top dog in the region. And right now it's kind of hanging in there, trying to stay relevant vis-a-vis other competitors like Singapore.
Down the front, please, to Jane, the lady in the red jacket.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to hear this discussion because it's not binary, it's multifaceted, it's music to my ears. By the way, I'm Jane Hardy, former Australian diplomat, proudly associated with the US Studies Centre. Ambassador Tong, you talked about India, you mentioned it in passing. You mentioned it in the context of a range of tools we have, the international community, to help shape what goes on in trade and other things. But I have to focus, and that was really wonderful to hear because we often get a very binary view here. You know, it's all about Trump and his tweets, and that's not what it's about. Washington is a very dense ecosystem, which is starting to work a little bit better in my view. My question about India is that I saw, having just decried Mr. Trump's tweets, that he is upset with Russia and Putin, and he's going to impose sanctions on Russia. And as part of that, there'll be a 50% tariff on countries that trade with Russia. India is a key one. How do you talked about entanglement, which is something that diplomats work on all the time, which for good or ill, it's an entanglement now of ideas, which may result in some disastrous effects on important partners like India.
Yeah. So I don't think he'll do it. So he threatened a 50% tariff on Europe, and then the next day had a phone call with the European president and changed his mind. When India points out that they're continuing to buy Russian oil, and would he please not tariff them, given that they're doing that, because in a sense, the fact that India does that helps stabilize global oil markets. The president will go, okay, yeah, whatever, and forget that he ever tweeted it. So, but the broader point about inconsistent messaging and you know, on an alternative day is scaring the bejesus out of people or treating them badly in the mosh pit of the Oval Office is not good diplomacy, and will make things more difficult going forward. I do think that U.S.-India relationship actually is quite strong and has a path forward on the trade piece, and I expect to see Trump visiting there sometime this year and reinforcing the relationship, and things going quite well. He's got a lot of respect for Mr. Modi, and some of that, the benefits of that deeper relationship with India were seen during the recent crisis between India and Pakistan, where by all accounts, the U.S. was at the very least not unhelpful in getting India and Pakistan to take a deep breath and stop shooting at each other.
We're coming up to the end now, and I'm actually going to take the moderator's privilege of asking the final question. And I wanted to end on an optimistic note, because a lot of the discussion tonight has been quite serious about really difficult challenges, including one of the issues we discussed, which was the undermining of democratic values and principles. So I wanted to put a challenging question to both of you, starting with Mike, because I know that's unfair, but you're my CEO, so I can get away with it. And ending with Kurt, to give Kurt the final word. I want you to tell us, what is the absolute best possible outcome of this breaking down of the system, the sort of wrenching changes that we're seeing out of the United States? Kurt mentioned that there's an opportunity for allies to fill the gap, but looking at how the US administration is trying to adjust to a Trump administration, and the US trajectory on tariffs and trade and the global order, what is the absolute best outcome we can hope from these changes, Mike?
People are looking to the courts, to the Congress to be like concrete barriers on the highway, so that when Donald Trump drives into him, his car smashes into pieces. And that's not what they're designed to do. They're more like those plastic things that are fixed to the ground that sort of bend a bit when you hit them, but you hit enough of them and it stops the car. And that, I think, is what is not just the best, and I think that's what's going to happen. The administration will, you don't take on Harvard Law School in the courts and win. The administration is almost certainly going to lose.
They have a law school there, right?
Yeah, yeah, they do. And by the way, the administration is taking on all these fights and trade and everything else. Some of the best lawyers have left. They've not confirmed senior people in the Justice Department. They are under some of the, my dad taught at law school, but some of the legal briefs apparently are very amateur coming out of the administration. They're expected to lose these court cases. The Supreme Court has, it's a conservative court, mostly appointed by Trump and by Bush. There are two justices on the right, Alito and Thomas, who are pretty supportive of what Trump defines as executive authority. But the other conservative judges, Amy Coney Barrett and others, are not. They're constitutionalists. So he's going to be losing a lot of the cases in the courts. The law firms, the universities, at first we haven't seen this in American politics in a very, very long time, if ever. At first, institutions were kind of cutting their own deals. They're now banding together. The universities have come together, law firms have come together. Some people say, well, gosh, the Democrats don't have a leader to stand up and fight Trump. In my view, that's the best thing that could happen to the Democrats, because these policies, all of them, are very unpopular. And the worst thing would be to have a Democrat getting up and taking attention away from them, in my view. Napoleon said, when your enemy is making a mistake, get out of the way. So I think there will be more damaged institutions, some, particularly the freezing of USAID, some NGOs, some institutions, some think tanks will not come back. Harvard will take a big hit for sure, even though they'll win in the courts. So there will be damage. But it's a tornado. It's not climate change. This is not a sort of new level of how the American people want democracy to work. All the polls show that. You'll see it in the midterms, and you'll start seeing it in Congress quietly at first. But it's a tornado. And I don't know how many tornadoes you get in Sydney, but even in Maryland, where I lived, and we live in McLean, right? We get tornadoes, and they knock things over, they damage things. And then the question is, how do you rebuild, and what can't be rebuilt? But it's not climate change, to mix all my metaphors up. This is not sort of the new climate. The American people think this is great. They elected him to tame inflation and deal with those kind of issues. And the tariff policy, the uncertainty in the economic policy is making it worse. That affects the weather in the courts, which affects the weather in Congress. And it all is going to start to make it very difficult for President Trump to sustain. Does he change? And the best case scenario is he sort of moderates in the next 6 months or a year. I wouldn't bet on that, but I think the trend lines to me are pretty clear.
Good.
That's actually great.
And that's an optimistic answer. But
I'm glad to hear that. I'd point to just a couple other hoped for. I'm not ready to pronounce clear signs of that trend yet, but a couple of things that I think we could hope for. One is a reestablishment of some form of consensus around the idea that economic integration across economies is a good thing. Having this dramatic experiment in disintegration, and it will fail, and then hopefully, as you're suggesting, be perceived as such, could reestablish some degree of view that that's bad policy, and it's better to focus on competitiveness rather than on putting up barriers to competition. Focus on one's own competitiveness. The second one is related to that I would like to see, and occasionally see signs of it in the U.S. conversation, that the way forward is not to do something boneheaded like Brexit or like Trump's tariffs, but again, to think about what can we do inside society, inside the United States and other societies to make them better and deal with the economic anxiety that is driving bad policy. Because the roots of this policy and the MAGA movement come from economic anxiety amongst broad swaths of the population who are uncertain about their job security, and uncertain about the safety net, unsure how to retrain for a new job, unsure whether their children are going to be in better circumstances than themselves, despite strong macroeconomic trends. And that relates to income disparity and lots of other things that can be addressed through good policy. And we're at a university, and one of the key things I think is education. That we need a reaffirmation of the idea that human capital needs to be invested in, and that is valuable. It probably needs to happen in different ways than has been done traditionally, but it should happen. And I hope that my own pet peeve is, and I really wish that like Hillary Clinton had made this the centerpiece of her campaign. Why, if 18, who's magically decided that education should stop at age 18, free education? I mean, does anyone know an 18-year-old who's ready to be like in society by themselves? Maybe your kids.
I got one. I'm ready to have.
Yeah. Well, mine were not ready. And so I spent a lot of money sending them to college. But there was probably another tens of millions of people in the United States who would equally benefit from cost-free couple more years of education. More focused on job training, more focused on being able to navigate society. And people don't talk about that, but I hope that becomes an expected norm for society going forward. Anyways.
Well, Kurt, you know your audience because you're here at a university, so I don't think anyone would disagree with you. I wanted to sincerely thank our two speakers tonight. Kurt Tong is here as part of the Asia Group, TAG, as its managing partner. So he's out in Australia thanks to TAG. They're a strategic consultancy firm that helps businesses understand and do operations in Asia. And with someone like Kurt, with his background, they have no better person to help them navigate those challenges. And also to thank my CEO, of course, Dr. Michael Green, to thank you, the audience, for taking the time to come out tonight. Also our online audience that I know is watching. And lastly, to thank Janine and her team for putting this all together, because without her, this wouldn't happen. So thank you very much for coming, and please come again next time.